The Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment System is a new assessment designed to more validly measure what students with significant cognitive disabilities know and can do. This presentation will provide information about generating purposes for reading in order to develop comprehension skills and describe how this applies to students with significant cognitive disabilities. This training, Generating Purposes for Reading, is one of a series of training videos that support teachers of students with significant cognitive disabilities in their efforts to teach and assess more effectively. Sponsored by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, this training is part of the professional development efforts by the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment Consortium. In this module, you will briefly review the Anchor Read Apply approach to reading comprehension instruction, learn about how to use the DLM essential elements to generate specific purposes for reading text, and consider activities that will allow your students to use their background knowledge to support comprehension and accomplish the defined purpose for reading. Text comprehension is a complex activity that can be overwhelming for students with significant cognitive disabilities. We often test comprehension by asking students WH questions after they have read. But how can we teach this complex skill? One approach is to engage in comprehension lessons using an Anchor Read Apply framework. This framework supports students in learning how to activate background knowledge based on prior experience or build new background knowledge that they can connect to information contained in or related to the text. The Anchor portion of the Anchor Read Apply lesson begins with a short activity to be completed prior to reading that helps students connect what they know or have experienced to the specific purpose for reading. Then, a specific purpose for reading is clearly stated just before students begin to read. Next, the teacher and students read the text keeping the purpose in mind. This reading can be independent, with a partner, computer-supported, or read aloud, but the reading is uninterrupted as students remember the text and think about the purpose. Once reading is completed, students get a chance to apply what they have learned as they engage in a group task that is directly related to the purpose for reading. The tasks are usually quite short and are intended simply as a check to ensure that students have successfully achieved the purpose. After completing the task, the teacher provides feedback, which includes referencing the text to either confirm student responses or provide an opportunity to reconsider an answer. For a more detailed explanation of this framework, be sure to complete the Anchor Read Apply module. Because students with significant cognitive disabilities benefit from repeated readings, the same book or passage may be read multiple times, but it is important to read it for a different purpose each time. Not only does this help students understand that there are many things to learn and understand in any text, changing the purpose for reading also keeps students cognitively engaged. Purposes for reading a text the first time can be fairly easy, and purposes can increase in complexity as students have additional opportunities to read the same text. Determining a purpose for reading is at the heart of the Anchor Read Apply approach. Planning lessons that use the Anchor Read Apply framework require the teacher to first identify the purpose. It isn't possible to plan the Anchor activity or apply task without first determining the purpose. But how does a teacher decide which purpose to focus on? One important consideration is that the purpose for reading should always require students to read and attend to texts of increasing length. While the purpose must be both clear and specific, the student should use information from the entire section of the text that was read to meet the purpose. For example, reading to find out the name of the main character in a book would be too narrow of a purpose. Generally, if you can use one finger to point to the answer in the text, the purpose was too narrow. Consider instead a purpose for reading that asks students to determine how the main character changed from the beginning of the story to the end. That requires attending to the entire text. Pause for Activity 1. Let's continue thinking about how to determine purposes for reading. The grade level essential elements provide the purposes for reading your students will be expected to demonstrate. For example, across grade levels, students will be asked to determine information in both literature and information text that pertains to key ideas and details, as well as craft and structure. Students will also be expected to integrate their own knowledge and ideas with what is presented in the text. Let's take a look at how you can use essential elements to determine purposes for reading and some sample activities that you can use to help students connect what they know with the purpose for reading. At each grade level, 3 essential elements in reading literature and 3 in reading information text focus on key ideas and details. As with all of the essential elements, descriptions of key ideas and details become more complex as students progress across the grades. An example purpose for reading that focuses on descriptions might be: read so that you can identify 3 things that describe the character in this book. Being able to accomplish this purpose would require that students are able to read to identify the main character, and it will require them to know what things that describe are. This is where the anchor activity is important. The goal during the anchor activity is to help students recognize that they do know something about things that describe. They could tell or identify from a list of things that describe themselves: the school lunch, their best friend, their favorite TV show, the worst day in their lives, and the list goes on and on. The students may not know how to tell or identify 2 things that describe the character in the book, but you can get them one step closer by using the anchor activity to help them recognize that they know something about telling or identifying things that describe. Another essential element in the cluster of key ideas and details involves answering who and what questions about text. Most students with significant cognitive disabilities require us to teach them how to answer questions. It isn't just a matter of comprehending the text. Students with significant cognitive disabilities often struggle to understand what the question is asking. One example of a more complex purpose for reading that addresses questions might be: read to tell me who is in this book and what that person wants to do. This requires students to deal with 2 different questions: who is in the book and what does the person want to do? How can you teach students to answer these questions and successfully achieve this purpose? Again, the anchor activity is the place to start. Use the anchor activity and the students' experiences every day to help them recognize that they know something about answering who and what questions that will help them when reading for the purpose. You could ask students to tell who are the people in your class or who are the people in your family. After they give you the names of some people, you could ask what one of the classmates likes to do when they are done with lunch, when they are on the playground, or at any other time that matches the student's experience. You could do the same thing in reference to a member of the child's family. Determining the purpose for reading is a multiple-step process that takes time when you get started, but gets easier with practice. The first step is to make sure that you are familiar with the essential elements in reading literature and reading information text at each of the grade levels you teach. The second step is reading and familiarizing yourself with the books and other text you are planning to use in your instruction. Once you know the content of the book, you can determine which essential elements can be addressed while reading the book. For example, you can't work on an essential element that asks students to determine the beginning, middle, and end if the text does not have a meaningful beginning, middle, and end. Finally, you will work from the essential element to generate the purpose for reading in terms that the students will understand. For example, students don't know what main idea means, but you can work with an essential element that asks students to identify the main idea and generate a purpose that asks students to identify the statement that best tells what this story is all about, or tell in 10 words or less what this story is all about. Pause for Activity 2. Let's look at some more examples of purposes for reading related to the cluster of essential elements that focus on craft and structure. Consider this example purpose. Read so you can tell me which one of these things happened in the beginning, middle, and end of this story. To do this, teachers would have to prepare a list of events that students would choose from when determining which of these things. This purpose also requires students to understand basic sequencing. We can use the anchor activity to help them recognize that they know about beginnings, middles, and ends in their everyday lives. For example, they know about the beginning, middle, and end of things they do most every day. They might know what happens at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the school day. They might know what happens at the beginning, middle, and end of lunchtime. Some students will have the communication skills to tell you these things, but for others, you could write 3 events and ask, tell me which one comes at the beginning of your school day, group time, recess, or specials. You could do the same thing for lunchtime and ask students to tell you which of the 3 things happens at the beginning, middle, and end of lunchtime. Some essential elements focus on integrating your knowledge and ideas with information presented in a text. This might involve comparing and contrasting characters or events in a text, comparing and contrasting 2 different texts on the same topic, comparing and contrasting a personal experience versus a written account of the same experience, or comparing and contrasting a written account versus watching a video or live performance of the same information. No matter what the specific purpose is, when comparing and contrasting, the goal is for students to determine what is the same and what is different about 2 similar but different things. One example of a purpose that you might use to address an essential element focused on comparing and contrasting is, read to identify 2 things that are the same and 2 things that are different between 2 characters, 2 books, or our trip to the zoo and the book we wrote about the trip. The specific thing you are comparing and contrasting will be based on the grade level you teach. In order for students to be successful in reading to accomplish this purpose, they must first activate their background knowledge about comparing and contrasting. Using an anchor activity, we can help students recognize that they know something about comparing and contrasting. In this example anchor activity, the teacher is activating student background knowledge about comparing and contrasting by asking students to compare and contrast 2 field trips, one to the museum and one to the fair. Other teachers might ask students to compare and contrast school lunch with lunch at home, winter with summer, or 2 well-known people at school. The important thing is to select 2 things to compare and contrast that students have experienced directly. In this example, the teacher asked students to identify the transportation they used to get to the museum and the fair, whether or not they needed permission slips, how noisy it was, whether they were inside or outside, and what they did. Once she got the students to provide that information, she then asked students to determine if they were the same or different. After completing the chart, her students were ready to read a book she had selected in order to identify two things that were the same and two things that were different about the two main events. In this module, you reviewed how to teach students to comprehend text using an Anchor Read Apply framework. The majority of the module focused on using grade-level essential elements for reading literature and information text to generate purposes for reading. Once the purpose is selected, the next step is to develop an anchor activity that will activate your students' background knowledge and connect your purpose for reading to something they already know. This allows students to focus on a specific purpose while reading in order to complete a related task once they are done. Educators can then go back to the text to point out what was correct about student responses or offer students the opportunity to think about and revise their responses. The Anchor Read Apply framework helps students build reading comprehension skills and build upon their knowledge and experience. For more information about reading comprehension instruction and the Dynamic Learning Maps alternate assessment system, please go to dynamiclearningmaps.org. Thank you for your participation.